Julian Vance believed in horror, but he didn't, on any level, believe in the supernatural. Horror, for Julian, was a craft. It was a precise, psychological mechanism. It was the art of taking a mundane life, a suburban family, a new job, a loving marriage, and introducing a single, corrosive element. A creak in the floorboards that didn't stop. A friendly dog that suddenly watched its owner with cold, assessing eyes. A shadow in the corner of the room that didn't move when the lights came on. He'd built a formidable career on this belief. 6 bestsellers, 2 of which were now major motion pictures, all bearing his stylized signature, Julian Vance. His speciality was the slow burn, the creeping dread that culminated in a single, explosive moment of awful clarity. But his new novel, The Blenheim Silence, was fighting him. The premise was solid, commercial even. A man, Mark, shattered by personal tragedy, retreats to a remote cabin to heal. But the cabin isn't empty. It's stalked by a local legend, the Blenheim Witch, a presence said to feed on grief. The problem, Julian felt, was authenticity. He was writing about profound isolation from his comfortable, Wi-Fi-equipped home office in the suburbs. He couldn't feel Mark's terror. His writing was flat, he felt. It was all too mechanical. So he decided to engage in a bit of what he jokingly called method writing. He found a cabin. The cabin, or one very much like it. It was listed on a niche rental site that specialized in off-grid digital detox. The listing was sparse. Blenheim Woods, 20-mile exclusion, no service, generator, wood stove, bring your own supplies. It was perfect. He told his agent he was going dark for 2 weeks to find the voice. He packed 3 cases of bottled water, a cooler full of vacuum-sealed meals, 2 extra cans of gasoline for the generator, and his laptop. The drive itself was the first chapter. The paved highway gave way to a state route, which dissolved into a county road, which, in turn, became a rutted, gravel logging track. The final 10 miles were a muddy trench carved between ancient monolithic pines that seemed to drain the sky of light. His SUV's tyres spun and bit, the engine whining in protest. When he finally reached the cabin, it was less a house and more a scar. A small, dark-timbered box hunkered against a steep, mossy embankment. It was late afternoon, and the encroaching forest already cast it in deep shadow. Inside, it smelled of cold ash, damp wool, and mice. A tattered sofa, a scarred wooden table, a single bed in a cramped loft, and a formidable cast-iron wood-burning stove. He clicked on the battery-powered lantern he bought, and its sterile LED light only served to deepen the corners into inky blackness. Perfect, he thought, a genuine thrill running through him. This is it. He spent an hour unpacking, firing up the groaning gasoline generator out back and starting a fire in the stove. The flames crackled, sucking the dampness from the air. He sat at the table, opened his laptop, and pulled up the manuscript. He sat back and let out an enormous sigh of satisfaction. this was what he was looking for. Complete and utter silence, save for the subdued sound of the wind running through the trees outside and the subtle bird song. This would be the perfect environment for his magnum opus. The best place for him to write the book that would really make him famous. He wrote for 6 hours straight. The words didn't just flow from him, they gushed from his mind effortlessly. In fact, it was as though the writer's block that had plagued him had now been obliterated from existence. He was Mark. He felt the impact of the watchful woods. He felt the way the silence could crawl inside you and make a home. When he finally looked up, with his shoulders aching, it was past 2 a.m. He'd written 10,000 words. He couldn't quite believe it. But now, his eyes were drooping, and he needed to rest. The fireplace had now burnt down to its embers, and a chill had taken hold. He slept a dead, dreamless sleep, and woke to a cold, grey dawn. The first 2 days were a creative ecstasy. He'd fall into the story, writing with a fever he hadn't felt since his first novel. He'd pace the small cabin, reading dialogue aloud, gesturing to the empty chairs. He'd take short, tense walks into the woods, but never far. The trees were far too thick, and besides, he had a terrible sense of direction. He'd never be able to find his way back, not easily, at least. The forest floor was a dense carpet of pine needles that muffled his footsteps, making him feel like a ghost. He felt watched, but chalked it up to the atmosphere. It was good for the book. On the 3rd morning, he opened the door to refill the generator and found it. It was sitting dead center on the worn, bristly doormat. A doll. Not a child's toy, but a crude, ritualistic thing. It was about 8 inches long, a bundle of twigs bound tightly with black twine. The body was padded with what looked like dried moss and scraps of mouldy burlap. It had no legs, just a frayed stump. A single, milky white button had been sewn into the burlap face. An unblinking, idiotic eye. A tuft of coarse grey-black hair, too real feeling to be synthetic, was tied to its head with a leather thong. Julian stared at it for a long minute. It definitely wasn't there when he arrived a few days ago. He didn't even think it was there last night. His first reaction was analytical. Who? There were no footprints in the mud, save his own from the day before. And how? He hadn't heard a sound. He wondered if it was a prank from some local kids, but he soon remembered he was in the middle of nowhere. Who would drive 20 miles down that nightmare track just to scare a renter they didn't even know was there? He crouched, examining it without touching. It didn't look like any doll that he'd ever seen. It was also absolutely filthy. It had a very strange smell to it, which he didn't recognize at all. But it had a certain charm to it, almost as if its imperfections added up to make it an interesting little curio. He should have thrown it into the woods. He should have burned it in the stove. He should have gotten in his car and left. He did none of those things. He was, after all, a horror writer. And this was material. Well, he said aloud, his voice being engulfed by the surrounding quiet. Aren't you a little cliché? He picked it up. It was heavier than it looked and strangely damp. He carried it inside and with a grim smile sat it on the writing desk, leaning it against his stack of reference books. "All right, critic," he said to it. "Let's see what you've got." He began to write, and the book unlocked from within him. The story poured out of him. The presence of the doll, sitting there with its one vacant eye, was a catalyst. He found himself talking to it, as a joke at first, but he found it was actually a very good listener. He'd heard stories from his old coder friends about the rubber duck method, where they talked to a simple yellow rubber duck about their coding problems, and it would help them to figure things out for themselves. Yes, this was his rubber duck. "Okay, little Blen," he'd mutter, pacing and sipping cold coffee. Does Mark board up the windows before or after he hears the whispering? He has to board them up, right? To show he's active. But maybe the witch wants him to trap him inside. The doll just stared. You're right, Julian would nod, spinning back to the keyboard. He traps himself. It's not the witch keeping him in, it's his own fear. God, that's good. He wrote through the day and deep into the night. The generator sputtered and died at some point, but he didn't even notice. He just kept typing in the dark as the laptop battery dwindled, with the screen's glow illuminating the doll's hunched silhouette. The next day, he found himself feeding the doll. He'd left a piece of beef jerky on the desk, and in the morning, it was gone. Mice, he told himself, with his mind already spinning plot points. Or a raccoon. Must have been a hole in the wall. But he knew, on some level he refused to access, that the cabin was tight. He'd seen no droppings and no sign of any holes. He left it a cracker. That vanished too. He was writing the best work of his life. His protagonist, Mark, was no longer a collection of tropes. He was a living, breathing man, suffocating under a blanket of supernatural dread. The Blenheim Witch was no longer a vague legend. She was a terrifyingly real presence, skittering on the roof, scratching at the door, whispering his name from the chimney. Julian stopped shaving. He barely ate, and when he did, he'd leave a tax for the doll. He was gaunt and wired, his eyes burning in their sockets. The lines between his world and Mark's world were blurring. When he heard a subtle scratching at the door, he didn't jump. He just nodded, with his eyes locked firmly on his screen. "I know you're there," he whispered, his fingers flying. He knows, and he's not afraid anymore. He's curious. He was writing the climax. Mark, having lost all hope, having been worn down by the isolation and the relentless psychological torment, was finally confronting the witch. It was a masterpiece of tension. He wrote a new ending, one that felt truer than anything he'd ever conceived. Mark didn't fight the witch. He didn't banish her with an ancient ritual. He surrendered. He opened the cabin door and walked out into the woods to meet his doom. Not in terror, but in exhausted, hollow-eyed acceptance. It was a bleak, powerful, nihilistic ending. It was brilliant. Julian typed the final words. and the forest swallowed him whole. He leaned back, with his entire body trembling with exhaustion and triumph. He'd done it. The Blenheim silence was finished. It was a 400-page, single-spaced monument to terror. He'd bled for it, literally as well as metaphorically, as he'd cut himself while slicing some jerky for him and the doll. "We did it," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. He turned to the doll, a grin splitting his chapped lips. "We did it, you magnificent little bastard." The doll was gone. The grin slid from his face. "Okay," he said, his voice suddenly loud in the cabin. "Very funny." He checked the desk. He scrambled onto his knees, patting the dusty floorboards. He looked under the table, but his heart was beginning to flutter inside his chest. That familiar feeling of fear when you lose something precious to you. "Where did you go, critic?" He stood up and scanned around the room. He'd grown attached to that silly little doll now, his muse. The one that had helped him to write his masterpiece. The story that would really put him on the map, and maybe even get him an interview on a late-night talk show. He'd dreamt many times about it before. As his mind was going a million miles an hour, he didn't even notice the icy air that was beginning to circulate around him. The fire in the stove had burned down to dull, red embers. He took a step towards the door, and he couldn't. He froze, his foot halfway to the floor. It was as though his leg just refused to work. His muscles were fine. It was his will. It was as though a wire in his brain had been snipped. He wanted to move, but the command dissolved somewhere between his mind and his body. What? He stood there, poised like a faulty mannequin, for a full minute. The terrible companion of panic was now beginning to surge through him. He must have been working himself too hard, and now his body was rebelling. He needed rest, but now his being was collapsing. He tried to shout, but his throat only produced a dry, clicking sound. Then, a new thought entered his head. It wasn't his own. It was cold, smooth, and utterly imperative. The story is wrong. He watched, as if from a great distance, as his own hand, trembling not with fear, but with a terrible, puppet-like purpose, reached for the thick manuscript on the table. "No, not that. Please, God, no." He tried to fight, to pull his arm back, but the compulsion was absolute and irresistible. It was like trying to stop the tide with a teaspoon. His fingers gripped the 400 pages of his masterpiece. His body turned, with a wooden abruptness that you would see in an old marionette, towards the wood-burning stove. "No!" he screamed inside his own skull. "That's my work! That's me!" He felt hot tears streaming down his face, but his expression remained slack and placid. His hand opened the stove's iron door. The handle was red hot, but he couldn't pull back his hand. The pain was unbearable, as the metal scorched his skin. The heat washed over his face. "Please, please no." The compulsion was pitiless. He took the first section, 50 pages of his brilliant, agonizing setup, and fed it to the embers. The paper browned at the edges, curled, and then erupted in a bright, silent flame. He was sobbing now. Great, racking, silent sobs that shook his shoulders but made no sound. He watched his best work, his very soul, turn to black, floating ash. His hand went back to the desk, grabbed the next section, and fed it to the fire. He burned it all. The rising action, the terrifying midpoint, the bleak, perfect climax. He burned every single word until all that remained of the Blenheim silence was a pile of grey-black soot. The compulsion faded, leaving him utterly hollowed out. Nothing more than a weeping, paralysed husk. He stood there for an eternity, listening to the sound of the cooling stove. Then the new thought came. Open the door. No. God, no. I won't. I won't. His legs began to move. One shuffling step, then another. He was a passenger in his own body. He walked to the cabin door. His hand, that traitorous piece of meat, rising to the lock. He was screaming, screaming, screaming in the locked-in silence of his mind. His hand turned the bolt. It slid back with a heavy, oily snick. His hand grasped the doorknob. He turned it. The door swung open with a low groan, letting in a rush of frigid, pine-scented night air. And she was there. She was standing on the porch, not 10 feet away. She wasn't what he'd written. She was worse. She was ancient, a thing of bark and shadow and rot. Her skin was the colour of wet birch, peeling away in strips to show something dark and wet beneath. Her hair was a tangled mat of dark green moss and what looked like barbed wire, crawling with black, glistening beetles. Her eyes were the worst part. They were utterly black, with no whites. They were fixed on him. She was holding the doll. She held it up, cradling it in one hand. Her other hand, a spider work of twigs and blackened bone, reached up and stroked the doll's coarse hair. She smiled. It was a terrible, lipless gesture. A splitting of her face that revealed rows of filed, moss-blackened teeth. She'd been listening. She'd been reading. She'd taken his story, devoured his creativity, and now she was here for the author. The story he'd burned had been his payment, and it wasn't enough. The witch slowly lifted one long, crooked finger. The nail was a yellow talon. She beckoned. Walk. He tried to root himself to the floor. He tried to slam the door. He tried to fall. His foot lifted. He stepped out of the cabin, onto the damp, cold-slapped wood of the porch. His bare feet registered the splinters and the cold, but he couldn't stop. He stepped off the porch and onto the muddy earth. The cold slime squelched between his toes. The witch turned, with her movements fluid and utterly silent, and glided back towards the all-consuming darkness of the trees. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. Julian Vance, best-selling author, master of psychological horror, followed her. He walked, stiff-legged and weeping silently, into the black, watchful heart of the Blenheim Woods. He never saw the cabin light again. He was never seen again. And the silence, the terrible silence of the woods, swallowed him whole.